In the early 1860s, Ben Holliday moved his stagecoach operation from the Oregon Trail further south to the Overland Central Stage Station, and he helped incorporate a mailing system. And this is because by the early 1860s, a large number of Native Americans realized that the wagons going through the Oregon Trail were an easy target. So he moved his operation to a more friendly area. The Oregon Trail was now a pretty well-established road, and all along it you had military bases and places where you could go and stop and send your mail back home. But because the Civil War was looming, a lot of soldiers were being sent back to the East Coast, and the Native Americans found it easy enough to attack the wagons and the stagecoaches. I mean, they're pretty hard to miss. And by 1861, Jack Slade became involved. He took up a job after the Mexican-American Wars, and he killed a man in the early 1860s and was transferred out here. Now, the man he killed was in Julesburg. The guy's name was Jules. He was the station captain. And after he killed him, they transferred him around because he was a ruffian. He would get into fights with people, but he gained this incredibly violent reputation. So before they fired him, they moved him out towards this area just outside of Rock Springs, Wyoming. He made a very bad name for himself. He killed a couple people, and he was known as getting really, really drunk and then driving down towards Denver and just beating the hell out of anybody who was in his stagecoach. And he would get out of the stagecoach and kick over the campsite and just disturb the fires and tell everybody he was going to kill him and say, "Serve me a drink." And he'd hold a shotgun in their face and make them put the drink on the muzzle of the shotgun. So he was very much hated. And this is the only stage station which exists as it still was in Jack Slade's time. And it was here that probably the most infamous massacre took place at the hands of Jack Slade. We don't know for certain that it was committed by him, but in 1863, as Slade was supervising the stage stops between the Sweetwater Creek and the North Platte River, the stage operator here blamed a massacre of 7 people on Jack Slade. Now, Slade blamed it on the Indians. These ruts right here are just outside of the Overland stage route. You can see the canyon that would have led you into Rock Springs, and on the hill overlooking the old stage station are the remains of at least 7 people who were killed, possibly by Jack Slade, an infamous outlaw of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Montana. And I wanted to point out that next to the grave of the 7 people who were killed in 1863, you have a grave apparently of just kind of a hobo from the 1950s. Kind of strange, considering that hobos were more in the Great Depression. And I haven't been able to find any information on who this man was, but he died in the early 1950s. And you can see that the Point of Rock stage station is still pretty much the same as it was back in the day. I mean, you have somebody here carving their name in the 1870s. The early 1870s. I mean, a couple of years after Jack Slade, but this building hasn't been reconstructed at all, as far as I can tell. And just outside of the Point of Rock stage stop, you got this. And this is one of the things that lets me believe perhaps outlaws did hide in the cliffs, waiting for a lowland people, and then when there were just a couple people coming through, it'd be easy enough to ambush them. Just enough to hide a gang of people if you were coming through here. In fact, the stage route is, and you can see now the railroad follows it as well, but there it is. By 1864, he'd been fired, and his violent temper and his drunken temperament got him killed up in Virginia City, Montana, by a group of vigilantes. He begged and pleaded for his life, but they killed him. His wife kept his body on ice for a while, and then they tried to send it back to the East Coast, but he was mistakenly sent to Salt Lake City, where he was buried there. Just near the old stage route, if you look around, you can see how well traveled this must have been. And one of the things that lets you know is the presence of purple glass. Now, that means it's been out in the desert sun for quite a while. And just moving along, you can see all the porcelain and glass, and probably up the road you'll see bullet shells. And this is the product of tens of thousands of people moving out west for the gold rush and to make their way to California and homestead. And the story begins out on the East Coast, and although his father was a politician, he abandoned his life over there, and he went to go join the army in the Mexican-American War. He occupied Santa Fe, and after this he was a changed man. Rather than return to his family, he went to go work for the Overland Central Stage Route, and Slade specifically controlled about 270 miles. But when he arrived at Julesburg, he found a man named Jules Benji. And Jules was a fascinating figure in his own right. He was half Indian, half French, and he was a gigantic man built like a bear. And when he first saw Slade, he said, "Ah, Jack Slade, I see." And Slade says, "That's Captain Slade." That was their first interaction, and it started the relationship that would end in murder. So they immediately were fighting, and in response to that, Benji said, "You won't last long." And according to reports, Slade replied, "Well, while I'm here, the mail will keep going through." So they began fighting. And because of the fact that a lot of stages which were going through were being robbed by the Native Americans right after they passed by Benji, a lot of people began to accuse him, and Jack Slade was one of those people. And then they also saw Benny entering the Native American camps and leaving with stolen property, so he made a very bad name for himself, and a fight ensued in which Benny ambushed Slade and shot him many times. Everybody thought that Slade was going to die, but he pulled through, and in fact, Benny was making plans for burying him in a dry goods crate when Slade leaned up on his elbow and said, "Benny, I'm going to take your ear. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to wear your ears around as jewelry." And he didn't believe him. Well, he got better, and the town nearly lynched Benny. They hanged him 3 times, but they let him down every time, and they said, "Go to Wyoming, never come back here, leave us alone, don't talk about this, and everything will be good." But while he was up near Laramie, he was saying, "I'm going to have my boys go down and kill Jack Slade." So Slade goes right up to Fort Laramie, and he talks to the army, and they say, "There's no law in the land. There's no police force. You're going to have to deal with this yourself. And if you kill him, we're going to say it's a case of self-defense." And that's exactly what Slade does. He hires 3 of his own thugs to go and capture Jules Benji, and he ties him to a corral. And there are different accounts of how he killed him. I believe he just shot him. But one account goes, and several people actually said that this is what happened, but it might just be mythology, that he tied him there and he said, "You know, I'm going to let you write your final will." And after he wrote several pages and they were ferrying ink back and forth from the barn house, apparently he wouldn't let him sign it. He cut his ears off and he stabbed him in the gut. And he buried them right there on the spot. Now, there's no evidence to back this up, but he did wear Benji's ear around for the rest of his short life. And I say short life because after this, he took to drinking. Once he got his operation up and running, and he became king of this 270-mile-long stretch across the Wyoming-Colorado border of the stage route, once this happened, he started drinking, and he ruled it with an iron fist, refusing to allow other stations to serve alcohol, but he drank all the alcohol in Julesburg, and eventually he created a very bad name for himself with the law because he would go down south of his stage route near Denver, and he would just walk into bars, break everything. There's an account of him walking up to a camp, kicking over the campfire, breaking all of their equipment, and then just saying, "I'm the infamous Jack Slade." Well, after it became clear that he killed Benji and several other people under very mysterious circumstances that you could argue whether or not it was self-defense, and after he had created enough trouble with the law, they finally forced the stage route to fire him for dereliction of duty. By that time, it was 1862. And for a while, he was just this outlaw wandering the Wild West and committing these crimes, breaking into saloons and beating the hell out of people. But people didn't touch him because he was already infamous at that point. He goes up to Virginia City and he gains a reputation for beating his wife and going into saloons and just roughing everybody up. So in 1864, the vigilantes in Virginia City, Montana, they arrest him. And the vigilantes, they formed a miners' court, and they unanimously declared that he was to be hanged. And apparently, whenever they passed down a judgment like this, whenever they did this to a bully, the bully would immediately begin sobbing and saying, "You're not to hang me, I'm sorry, I'll abandon my ways." And apparently several men in the miners' court did cry for him, but they knew that they had to hang him. So they hanged him from a nearby corral, and his wife was still distraught over the loss of her husband, so she put his body on ice. It was winter at that time, and then she pickled it in alcohol and wanted to send it back to his family on the East Coast, but somehow it made its way down to the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And he was buried here for a period of time, but in 2013 they tried to look for his remains underneath the tombstone, weren't able to find anything. Now I've come here because his tombstone was apparently 50 yards down that way, but this is the pauper's plot where all of the poor people, as well as some people who the church doesn't like to acknowledge, they're buried behind me with no tombstone. The mental institution, a couple of slaves, people who died as vagrants at the hospital. So I believe Slade is buried here about 50 feet away from where his grave is supposed to be.